Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome to the first video of 2024. I kinda feel like I'm a little overdue for a Star Wars build, so in this video, that's exactly what we're gonna do. So over the Christmas period, I finally got done playing Jedi Survivor. A little late to the party, I know, but one of the places that you spend a lot of your time in the game is a planet called Koboh. And Koboh has a really interesting aesthetic. Most of the planet's terrain is made up of rugged rocky cliffs, and this backdrop's great, especially for a Jedi Knight whose favourite pastime seems to be rock climbing. But it also made me think that it might be a pretty good backdrop for a diorama. And if I'm going to be able to pull this off, I'm going to have to use a few techniques that I have very little experience in. And because of that, I'm going to be splitting this video up into zones. And we're going to start with zone 1, which I'm going to call the comfort zone. I really like this zone, mainly because it's going to be filled with things I've done hundreds of times before. Foam rocks, photo frame bases, terrain paste, the lot. So it should go pretty smoothly for a while. And as with most of my builds, we're going to start out with a photo frame for the base. I like to use photo frames not only because they provide you with lovely little nuggets of wisdom, but they also make for a nice square sturdy base, and it saves me a lot of time making something. We just need to start out by removing all the unnecessary pieces. And after roughing up the edges with a little bit of sandpaper, the frame's ready for its first layer of XPS foam. This is going to make for a nice sturdy platform that we can start to build the rest of our terrain on top of. I decided pretty early on that a cool way to frame this piece might be to have the cliff face over to one side. Hopefully this is going to give for a better viewing experience around the entire piece and give the illusion that there's a little bit more going on than there actually is. That's probably going to be easier said than done, but with this in mind, I started laying down pieces of XPS foam to form my basic cliff shapes. And once I was finished with my game of foam Tetris, I could then start bulking out the sides with some smaller pieces of foam, just to try and get rid of some of those straight lines. Then it was over to the hot wire cutting table to remove all the overhanging edges, and we were just about ready to start carving some rock texture. I started by using the handheld foam cutter to try and give all the rocks a little bit more of a natural flow. Then once the flow of the rocks started to look a little more natural, I could use some unnatural heat from my heat gun to unnaturally make the rocks look more natural. Then it was on to carving in some extra detail with a number of different tools. There's not really a right or wrong way of doing this. I usually just start out by carving the bigger details with a utility knife, before moving on to a hobby blade and a stiff brush to add in those extra details. And I'm not too worried about any big gaps that may have been left between the rocks, because they're going to get filled down the road. And once I was happy with the look, and I'd made plenty of mess on my workbench, I could then move on to cutting a big hole in the foam, which was going to house the 3D printed base that Cal is eventually going to be standing on. This base is part of a set of 3D files that I found for Cal online, but we'll talk more about that later. The only reason I'm fitting this in now is because I won't really get a chance further down the line. Plus, we can add the terrain paste over the top of this as well, to make it look a little less out of place. And with the bulk of all the foam cutting out of the way, it was time for a quick tidy up. And because this isn't a cleaning channel, I then moved on to fit in the fascia using some pretty thick construction card. I won't hang around too long on this step because it is quite boring. But basically, I cut 4 sides to the shape of the terrain out of the construction card, then just locked it all in place with some double-sided tape and some matte Mod Podge. Then it was time to fill in some of those gaps with some sculptor mould. This is another one of those steps where there's not really a lot to go wrong. It's just a case of pushing the sculptor mould into a lot of the holes and blending it to try and make everything as seamless as possible. And this is pretty easy to do by using a little bit of water on the end of your finger and following that up with a stiff bristle brush. And after about 24 hours of drying time, we were ready to give the foam an extra layer of protection and its first layer of texture, which means it was time to mix up a terrain paste. The go-to recipe at the moment for this terrain paste is cast in plaster, matte Mod Podge and a little bit of water just to make it a bit more brushable. But apparently my local Hobbycraft doesn't stock Mod Podge anymore, so I was kind of forced to try their own decoupage medium. And it's kind of funny that it's about the same price as Mod Podge. So hopefully it works just as well. But after adding in some paint just so it's a little easier to see where I've been, I set to work giving the whole piece a nice uniform layer, whilst making sure to fully blend in that 3D printed base. And after a little encouragement from the heat gun, the piece was pretty much dry and ready for the next layer of texture. Most of this layer was made up of some small stones and some extra fine sand. This all then got locked into place with some more of that not Mod Podge. Although sand's a great material to work with, sometimes I don't like it. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. But after making the workbench a little more soft and smooth, I locked all of that texture in with some IPA and some scenic cement from Woodland Scenics. And after a few hours of drying time, the piece was ready to receive a few subtle hints of vegetation, and I decided to start out with a few grass tufts. I've had this grass matting from Gauge Master for quite a while now, and I'm slowly trying to make my way through it. I guess the trouble with it is that it's quite situational. The grass lengths are about 12mm, so they're quite tall, and they're in this certain shade of green that's just a little bit too bright for most things. But in this case, it's kind of perfect. I can just tear the sheet to any size that I want, and then just use a little more not Mod Podge to hold each tuft in place. And after about 15 minutes of gardening work, I was left with a piece that had some really nice texture that was just about ready for priming. Oh, and I painted the sides black off camera because I was getting pretty sick of staring at the white construction card. But after loading the airbrush up with some of Vallejo's black primer, I set to work priming the whole piece with a zenithal highlight. Then once all the primer was dry, it was time to add some colour with some acrylic washes to make these rock surfaces look a little more Koboh-y. I started out with my usual go-to of a dark grey wash. Then working in small sections at a time, I could then start to wet blend in some of those rocky colours. And again, this is quite easy to do. I just needed to remember to apply my lightest colour towards the top end of the rock faces. And in this case, that was Iraqi sand from Vallejo. Then I used some orange brown and some brown sand for those darker recesses. All these tones then got built up in a series of layers, and once they'd all had some time to dry, I used a fairly watered down wash of burnt umber across the whole rock face to tie everything together. So now that I've got the basic colours locked in, the next thing to do on the list is give the grass tufts some colour. I started by base coating all of the tufts with some mahogany through the airbrush. This is going to help give the tufts a nice shadow when it comes to applying the dried out yellow colour. Then it's just a case of building up a few transitions with a number of layers. This is easily done by just adding a little more Iraqi sand into the yellow mix for each layer. And with that step out of the way, I could then move on to blocking out the rest of the dirt texture with some flat earth from Vallejo. I added in a few highlights on the high points with some Iraqi sand, and then started work on the smaller details. There's no doubt that painting stones individually can be a bit of a tedious task. But when I find myself working in these slightly larger scales, I definitely think it's worth giving it my time. Especially when all it takes to tie them all together is a little more of that burnt umber wash. So I finally think I've reached a stage where I'm happy with this part of the diorama, and that means it was probably about time to move into zone 2, which I'm going to call the learning zone. There's lots of different ways that Cal likes to make his way around Koboh. And like we've already mentioned, one of the main ways is climbing, and there's loads of things he likes to climb on. But it's mostly things like grates, platforms and ropes. And I wanted to try and incorporate some of these features into this build. And that meant I was going to have to build a few bits and pieces. But luckily for me, I've got a 3D printer, so I printed out a couple of these grates that I found on Thingiverse. Obviously these were designed for the use on the tabletop, so that meant I needed to make a few modifications. Now I don't have a ton of experience with scratch building, hence why this is the learning zone. So I just wanted to aim to have these pieces look half convincing and just have some fun with it at the same time. So after raiding my bits and bobs box, I came across a few bits and bobs that were probably going to be good enough to get the job done. I decided a good place to start would probably be to try and build some framework on the back of the grates with some barbecue skewers. And then for some interesting looking texture and that extra bit of detail, I added a bunch of different sizes of cable ties down the side. These were just held in place with some super glue and then trimmed back to match the length of the barbecue skewers. Then I added a toothpick to help support the piece in the foam. And then to give the piece that rugged, bodged together Koboh look, I added in some more supports using some leftovers from a sprue. These then got incorporated in with some more barbecue skewers and a couple of pieces of wire cable, before giving all of the flat surfaces a coat with some knot Mod Podge for that little added texture. And the plan from here was to build something that would hold a rope out over the edge of the cliffs, and then place it next to these grates on the top. And I did build it, and it did go okay, but unfortunately I had some memory card issues.
What is this, amateur hour?
I know, not great, but this is the learning zone after all, and I did manage to salvage some footage towards the end. But just to summarise, I made the rope by twisting together a couple of pieces of copper wire, which I threaded through the hole in this makeshift rope holder, if that even is a thing, which was made from leftover pieces of sprue and various sizes of tube styrene. And I glued on an extra couple of pieces of wire in the middle, just to give it a little extra detail. And once I had it primed, it was ready for paint. I started by giving the entire thing a base coat with some of Vallejo's engine grey. Then I added a highlighting layer with some of the Army Painter's stone golem, before dry brushing all of the high points with some matte white, just to make all those details pop. And this sort of left me with a nice old galvanised steel kind of look, but it was still looking a little too clean, so it needed some weathering. So I used some of AK's dark streak and grime. This enamel wash is like a really dark green, and it might seem a little odd to apply green to something like this, but I tend to find it gives her a more natural weathered look. And at this point it was still looking pretty boring, so it was time to add a splash of colour. And I decided to go with some Zealot Yellow speed paint from the Army Painter. I didn't want to go too overboard with this, so I just applied the speed paint to the styrene collars. Maybe we can say these parts have been repaired in the past or something. Then I applied some of this hardened leather speed paint onto the ropes. And that was the rope holder finished, so then I could turn my attention to the grates. I decided I was going to paint these in a similar way and pretty much use all of the same steps. So after priming the grates, I gave them all a base coat with some mahogany through the airbrush. Then I added in the first layer of highlights by dry brushing on some orange brown. And once I had good coverage, I then moved on to some brown sand just for the edges. Then I moved on to the speed paint layer, and this time I decided to go with some sand golem that I applied through the airbrush. I'm using the airbrush this time because there's lots of tiny little recesses in this thing, and I don't really want the speed paint to pool up too much. But after letting all of that thoroughly dry, I could then move on to weathering with the enamels. I started by using some of the streaking grime again just to highlight all of the rivets. And what you also notice in game is a lot of the climbable surfaces have like these dirty streaks down the middle. This is basically the game's way of telling you that this surface is actually climbable, so I wanted to try and replicate that using some earth effects from AK. So I applied the enamel just down the centre of the piece, trying to feather it out with a soft brush. Then it was on to applying some white spirit with a finer tipped brush to try and create some more streaks. And once that final layer was dry, both pieces were ready to be fitted to the cliff face. I just locked them both in place with a little more of that knot Mod Podge. And you know, a couple of minutes ago when I said I printed a couple of those grates? So I printed out a couple of these grates that I found on Thingiverse. Well, this first one that I printed was supposed to be just a test really, but I actually quite liked the look of it and decided not to let it go to waste, so I quickly knocked up this little platform off camera. And once I had it fitted into place, I just blended it in with the rest of the terrain with some sculptor mould and some brown paint. And once that layer was dry, I added my texture and my acrylic washes in the same way as I did with the rest of the landforms. And to finally finish off the base, I added in a handful of these plants that I had from my Diorama presser paste stash. And that was the base finished, but there's still something missing, or should I say, someone. And that was the man himself, Cal Kestis. And of course his little droid companion BD1. And I managed to find this awesome looking 3D sculpt from KC Studios. They have some really awesome looking stuff, so I highly recommend you go and check them out. But once I got Cal downloaded, I just needed to make a few adjustments and get him scaled properly and then get him printed out. Then I could remove all the support material and get everything primed, ready for paint. Then I guess it was finally time to move into the third and final zone. The one that I'd been dreading the most. The panic zone. So it's no secret that I've always admitted that I can't paint people. I mean, I've even got people to paint stuff for me in the past. I'm more than comfortable with painting terrain or vehicles or even the occasional droid. Maybe sometimes not to the most realistic standard, but I can normally get things to a stage where I'm quite happy with it. It's not perfect, but it will do, kind of thing. But there's something about skin tones and especially eyes that I can't quite wrap my head around. So really, this is going to be my first serious attempt at trying to paint a person or a figure. And I figured that the best place to start would probably be the trousers, or to some of you, the pants. And I think the best way to paint this is probably going to be to treat it the same as I would with any piece of terrain. And that's going to be to build up all of the base colours in a series of layers, and then I can come in and add the final details afterwards. So with this in mind, I applied my first layer of flat earth, which was really heavily watered down, almost into like a glaze. And once that first layer had dried, I could then come in and add a few more layers, until I had coverage that I was happy with. Then I could move on to applying some highlights. I mainly used Vallejo's brown sand for this, and just concentrated on trying to apply them on top of the creases in the material. Then I could concentrate on reinforcing some of those shadows, with another glaze. And this time I used a black paint with a little bit of burnt umber mixed in, just to give the darker black tone a little more warmth. I concentrated on applying this around a lot of the darker recesses, like under the pockets and under his gun holster and belt. And when all those layers were dry, I was left with this. It's by no means perfect, but it turned out a darn sight better than I thought it would, so I was pretty pleased. So I then moved on to painting the rest of the details on his trousers using the same methods. I applied the base coat in a few layers in the form of a glaze, then added in my highlights, and then went in with the shadows. I did mix it up a little bit with the boots by first applying some black Templar contrast paint from Citadel. Then I come in with some dark grey highlights on top of all the high points. Then finished off with another layer of black Templar, but this time really heavily watered down. And after picking out the smaller details, the boots were also finished. But that did mean we were getting a little bit closer to painting that face. And honestly, I had such a bad feeling about it, I thought I might not even make this video after, but we'll just see how it goes. But for now, it was time to put what little confidence I'd found into painting the torso. So I started by mixing up some of the Army Painter's deep blue into that glaze mix. This was going to be the base coat for Cal's leather jacket, which is like a really dark blue. Then I could start applying it in a number of...
Coward! You make me sick.
Leave me alone, please.
Hiding in the shadows. Hiding from who you truly are.
Oh!
You can't escape yourself.
and it wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. Just following them steps is pretty simple, and I think it leads to quite a good result. I didn't want to paint the silver details in because I needed to hit everything with a matte varnish at the end. So for now I called the torso finished and detached the arms again before moving on to the step that had been keeping me up at night. I figured I was probably going to need as much help as I could get with this step, so I decided to follow a pretty popular guide that was recommended to me by a friend. Basically, the guide states that you just need to give the face a base coat with some of Vallejo's brown sand. Then the next step is to give everything a very dilute wash with a deep browny red colour, which left Cal with this pretty rough sunburnt look. Then it's on to blocking out the main features of the face again with some more brown sand. So the top of the chin, the forehead, most of the cheeks and the bridge of the nose. Then it's just a case of building highlights on those areas by gradually lightening up the mix with a paler skin tone. And I decided to use some of this corpse pale from the Army Painter. I just mixed a little into the original brown sand colour, gradually lightening up the mix after each highlighting layer, just basically until I had a look that I was happy with. I think in total I probably applied about 3 layers of highlights, which seemed to work quite well for me. And then just to make my life a little bit easier, I decided to use some of this Fire Giant orange speed paint for his hair. Then it was time to finally put everything I'd learnt to good use and try and paint his eyes. And it didn't go quite so good. And after that little bump in the road, I wasn't really in the mood to try and paint Cal's eyes again, so I turned my attention to the other details. After giving his boots and trousers a very light dusting with some more brown sand, I hit all the other parts with some matte varnish. And once that was thoroughly dry, I could then come in and pick out all the silver details with some aluminium from Vallejo. The lightsaber then got a very subtle weathered look by using some more of that streaking grime from AK. And then, because I couldn't really dodge it any longer, I finally painted in the eyes. I started by painting them black first to try and create a little bit more shadow. And then making really sure just to take my time, it was on with the matte white. Then I used an old airbrush needle and some olive green paint to apply his pupils. But all jokes aside, this did give me a bit of a headache painting the head. I mean, I think in total to paint Cal altogether was about 4 days. But for a first attempt, I think it's okay. It does the job, and if anything, it made me want to try and paint something else, so that can only be a good thing. But now I finally had Cal put together, he was almost ready to join his buddy BD1 on the base. But what's a Jedi without his lightsaber? So there was one more thing I needed to add to finish this piece off. I picked up a few of these blue filament LEDs on eBay. Hopefully these are going to do a good job of acting as a miniature lightsaber. But when wiring it up, I did come across a bit of a dilemma. My original plan was to run the wires through his arm, down his leg and into the base. But to be honest, I didn't think this was going to look the greatest, so I had to have a little think.
Now that's a dilemma.
The solution I came up with was to use some of this enamel coated copper rod. Not only is this going to allow the lightsaber to be held up into position, it can also act as the negative side of the circuit. And to hide the 0.2mm brass cable that was acting as the positive side of the circuit, I used some clear heat shrink tubing that's going to hold the wire in place and at the same time still let the light show through. And once I'd painted the end to match the rest of the hilt, it was ready to be fitted into place on the base.
Dilemma solved.
Then after getting Cal finally attached to the base, I used a little drop of super glue to attach the lightsaber to the hilt. Then all I needed to do was fit a battery pack and a toggle switch to complete the circuit, and Cal and BD1 were finally ready for their glamour shots. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks again for watching everybody, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.